Good evening, everyone. We're waiting for people to muddle into the room, so just please be patient for a moment or two. What a beautiful day it was in Northeast Ohio, wasn't it? This is the Hudson Library and Historical Society. We're waiting for people to file in. We'll begin very shortly. Paul, I'm glad to see you got some yard work done today. I tried, but got distracted. People are still filing in, so please be patient while we get everybody in, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I think people are still joining us, but in case you don't know, my name is Gwen Mayer, and I am the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. This evening's virtual program is Andrew Porwancher and the Jewish Hamilton, but I have a few little commercials first. As many of you are aware, we have a wonderful slate of upcoming programs that I hope you'll pay attention to and register for. Soon we have Richard Munson coming. He is the featured Morgan Lecture, the Morgan Lecture of Entrepreneurship. He will be next week at the library, and he's talking about from tech to table and interesting things like robotic bees. And yes, they do exist. I learned a lot about robotic bees from Mr. Munson. He will be speaking next week, and he will be live here at the library. Following that, we have Amanda Flowers. Some of you may know she used to be a librarian, but she is a prolific mystery writer, and she will be speaking later in the month on the 25th in person about her newest cozy mystery. I think it's called Blueberry Blunder. On June 5th, we have Kate White coming into town. She is a mystery author from the East Coast, and she has a wonderful book called well, I forgot the name of it, but she has a wonderful mystery that I haven't written yet, but I'm going to. And on June 28th, we have Ruth Ware coming to town. I believe her book is called The 0 Hour, and she will be here in person. I would encourage you all to take a look at our upcoming programs on the library website, as well as our brochures, and register for them. And while I'm advertising, I want to remind you that Andrew's book is at the Learned Owl. I have to tell you, I told him and I've told other people, it's probably the third best book I've read this year. And remember, I read quite a number of books, so that's a high compliment from me. I would encourage you all to purchase it or get it from your local library and read it. Tonight, I went looking for a biography of Eliza Hamilton, and I was happy to find out that it was checked out. So apparently we're all becoming more knowledgeable about the Hamiltons. Now, this evening we have Andrew with us, and he is from Princeton, New Jersey, born and raised. What a place to be born in. He is a graduate of Brown and Northwestern, and ultimately from Cambridge. He currently is the Wick Carey Professor at Oklahoma University or Oklahoma State?
University of Oklahoma.
University of Oklahoma. Thank you very much. And he has written this phenomenal book that has gotten a great deal of attention called The Jewish Hamilton. Some of you may know that Alexander Hamilton has gotten a lot of press lately, maybe because of a little musical that happened to go around the country. But we will ask Andrew right off the bat, is that what stimulated your interest in Mr. Hamilton?
Should I take it away?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gwen, for the invitation. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning in. I'm really excited to get to talk to you folks, partly because when I was a kid growing up, my grandparents lived in Youngstown, and they would take me to Cleveland for games at the newly opened Jacobs Field. And so I have a lot of very warm memories from the 90s as a kid visiting Ohio. And so it's really great to be able to talk to such a great institution in the Hudson Library and Historical Society in such a culturally rich part of the country. Alexander Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a new Jerusalem. After his mother's tragic death, the courts denied him his inheritance, his birthright, and he had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic skills to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of exodus, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't merely similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that Hamilton was himself a Jewish immigrant. And uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins, it's not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his American adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Hamilton was Jewish, according to traditional Jewish law, the halakha, I have to make the case that Hamilton's mother was Jewish. Now, we know that his mother was not born a Jew. And so I have to make the case that she likely converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, it's part of the US Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it's there that Rachel meets and marries a merchant named Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann Levine was Jewish, that Rachel converted to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a non-Jew, still she chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Hamilton scholars have long told us that Johann Levine is not Jewish because supposedly he's not identified in the Danish land records and census registers as a Jew. Now, the problem is these scholars hadn't actually bothered consulting the original primary source material from the Danish West Indies. So I went through these records. I learned enough Danish to go through them. I went through 3,000 of them. What did I find? Well, it turns out that these scholars were right. Johann Levine is not identified as Jewish in these records, which would be problematic for my thesis today had I not also uncovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in these records. These records didn't record religion as a category. And this absence of the word Jew next to Johann Levine's name in these records, it's been the entire basis for a century of Hamilton scholars to deny his Judaism. What else do we know about Levine? Well, we know his name was Levine. His name actually appears in a variety of spellings. Lewin, Lavian, Lewin, names that match how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. We know that he was a merchant, a common Jewish profession at that time. He was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews. He had come to St. Croix from an island with a large Jewish community. And Hamilton's own grandson explicitly identified Johann Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. So if Johann were Jewish, and there's not a shred of evidence otherwise, is it possible that Rachel converted to Judaism to marry Johann? Well, consider this. They have a son after their wedding, a year later, And this son, Peter Levine, is not infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Decades later, as an adult, Peter Levine joins the Anglican Church, but in order to join the church, he has to undergo an adult baptism. But Anglicans practice infant baptism. His need for an adult baptism only makes sense if he was converting to Christianity. Now, that's just one piece of evidence for you to consider. You know, Hamilton scholars, they're mired in the assumption that Johann and Rachel and Peter were all cradle to grave Christians. And so they are baffled by Peter's need for an adult baptism. If, however, we take seriously the idea that Johann Levine was Jewish and that Rachel, in all likelihood, converts to Judaism to marry him, then that would make their son Peter a Jew, and his need for an adult baptism, this long-standing mystery that has befuddled Hamilton biographers for generations, it's suddenly easily explained. Now, Johann and Rachel had a troubled marriage. He has her imprisoned for infidelity, and when she gets out of prison, she absconds from St. Croix, leaving behind Johann and their son Peter, and she ultimately winds up on the British Caribbean island of Nevis. And it is there that Rachel bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, unquestionably, James Hamilton was a Gentile, but there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. Now, if Alexander Hamilton were born Jewish, we'd expect that he would be circumcised. If born Christian, baptized. There are, unfortunately, no surviving circumcision records for any of the Jews that were living on Nevis at that time. There are extant baptismal records which show no entry for Alexander, but more compelling than that is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table so they would be eye level, and he would recite to her the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. Now, I did not discover that. I'm not the first person to discover that there was no baptismal record. I'm not the first person to discover that he went to this Jewish school. These are well-established facts about Hamilton's youth. How have biographers made sense of them? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school. That must be why he goes to the Jewish school. It's a very neat and tidy explanation, and one that would be problematic for my thesis today had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through those church records and found that both on Nevis and indeed throughout the Caribbean, children born out of wedlock were routinely infant baptized. We have precious little grounds for assuming that Hamilton's out of wedlock birth goes any way towards explaining the fact that he doesn't get a baptism, that it goes any way towards explaining his enrollment at a Jewish school. What's more, Hamilton scholars make an error in assuming that a Jewish school would have taken a child who was understood to be Christian by that community, particularly in that time and place. Now, Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to cultivate in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to instill in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their fellow Jews spread out across the diaspora. And there was a Talmudic prohibition that a number of people interpreted to prevent Jews from teaching non-Jews the Torah. And so for all of these reasons, it would be rather remarkable to find a child who was considered Christian attending a Jewish school. In fact, it would be more than remarkable. It would be unprecedented. I have never found, and no scholar of 18th century Jewish history I've ever spoken to has ever found, a single recorded instance of a Christian child attending a Jewish school anywhere in the world in the 18th century. Moreover, Hamilton scholars, in thinking this Jewish school would educate a Christian child, they are misunderstanding the nature of Jewish-Christian relations on Nevis at that time. And I want to take a few minutes to unpack that part of my argument because it is absolutely central to the book. So, quick plug. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. On some islands, 40% of the free population was Jewish, right? In Hamilton's island, 25% Jewish, right? I don't know if these are quite, Shaker Heights numbers, but they're respectable. So you have all of these Jews. I mean, there's a Dutch island where there are more Jews on a Dutch Caribbean island than in all of North America. And why are there so many Jews? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for growing sugar, the 18th century's ultimate cash crop. So lucrative was the sugar trade that Britain generated more wealth from its collection of small Caribbean islands than from all of its North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to decide between giving up one small sugar island in the West Indies or all of Canada, and they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers, willing to stomach some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies, stood to profit for that tolerance. So to the extent that Jews and other religious minorities like Quakers and Catholics are tolerated on these Caribbean islands, it's not out of a sense of celebrating religious diversity, as it is begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of Jews was always precarious on Caribbean islands, especially as islands reach peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Now, Jews were convenient scapegoats in troubled times. Jewish success in commerce was often perceived to come at the expense of Christians. Jewish merchants were often accused of stealing bread from the mouths of Christian children through supposedly deceptive Jewish trading practices. This was drawing on an old anti-Semitic trope that had deep roots in European history. So the setup on Nevis in particular, in Charlestown, the main port town on Nevis where Hamilton lives, the configuration is suggestive of the fraught tenor of Jewish-Christian relations at that time. Jews are not dispersed evenly throughout Charlestown on Nevis. They're concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter is not the most desirable real estate on the island. It is sandwiched between a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on one side and the prison on the other. This is very instructive, right? Jews in Europe had long dwelled in their own, often less desirable districts. In other words, Jews and Christians, they're not coming to the New World. They're not coming to places like Nevis and creating a whole new set of social and spatial relationships between the two faith groups. They are recreating patterns they already know, patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, cultural, religious, and geographic, between Jews and Christians. Now, why have I taken such pains to reconstruct this fraught tenor of Jewish-Christian relations on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that a Jewish school would have educated a Christian child at that time on Nevis unless they considered him one of their own. The stakes for Jews, their continued residence on Nevis, too doubtful. The politics with their Christian neighbors, too dicey to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. Now, when Hamilton is about 11, he and his mother wind up on St. Croix. She runs a store out of the first floor of a building. They live together on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple of years until both mother and son fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Alexander Hamilton, he pulls back from the brink, but in February of 1768, his mother, Rachel, takes her dying breath, leaving behind this 13-year-old son. The details of Rachel's passing and burial are instructive for our purposes today. Notably, Rachel was not buried in the church cemetery. Now, burial in a Jewish cemetery is not an option at that time on St. Croix, because St. Croix was home to a few scattered Jews, not the sizable Jewish community to be found on some of these other Caribbean islands. And so your only option if you were Jewish was to be buried at the home of a relative. And in fact, Rachel is buried at her sister's estate. Notably, Rachel's death is recorded under the name Rachel Levine. She had not seen Johann for 18 years, and yet she keeps the name Levine until her dying day, hinting at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Now, a number of Hamilton scholars note that her death is recorded in a church register, and they take this evidence to mean, seemingly reasonably, that she must have been a member of that church. But what these scholars don't realize is that states don't start keeping civil records of deaths until the 19th century. In the 18th century, many states are reliant on church records as de facto civil records. And so for that reason, churches were sometimes recording Jewish deaths to then be turned over to the state for civil purposes. And this was particularly likely to be common in a place that did not have enough Jews to have its own synagogue with its own records to turn over to state authorities. A number of Hamilton scholars also mention that a Christian clergyman presided over Rachel's funeral rites. And this too might be problematic for my thesis, except there's not a shred of evidence to support it. If you look at all the Hamilton biographers who make this claim and you look in their footnotes, they all just cite another Hamilton biographer who makes this claim. It is wholly circular. It is yet one more fiction in the mythology that continues to shroud our understanding of Hamilton's early years and kin. Now, Hamilton, between the ages of 13 and 18, is living as an orphan on St. Croix. His father's long gone. His mother has passed away. And I suspect that any Jewish identity he might have had dies with Rachel Levine. He's no longer living on Nevis, home to the sizable Jewish community that had educated him. He's on St. Croix with a small handful of Jews. His mother has passed. His communal and familial ties to Judaism were severed. It would be surprising if a youth as plucky and as precocious as Alexander Hamilton further burdened his already troubled life with a second-class religious status. And so Hamilton, certainly later in his teenage years and certainly in his American adulthood, does not identify as Jewish. He identifies as Christian. And yet, Hamilton never forgets. No other American founder did more to make the promise of equality real for America's Jewish community. But I don't want to leave the Caribbean quite yet, because there's yet more evidence that corroborates my theory of the case today. Hamilton, during this interregnum, when he's aged 13 to 18, living on St. Croix, he gets a job working for an import-export company at a time when, think about other American founders, they grow up on plantations, on farms, they're versed in an agrarian form of economy. Hamilton, he is learning in these formative years about international trade, about debt, finance, currency. He is honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future under George Washington. Given the prominence of Jewish traders in the Caribbean at this time, it is all but certain that Hamilton would have come into contact with just the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'd later collaborate in New York City in building the American financial system. When Hamilton was 17, he was called to give testimony in a case implicating his employer. And Hamilton, on the witness stand, is interrogated by the opposing counsel for his competency to swear on the Christian Bible. And Hamilton is asked how he identifies, and he says, well, I'm Anglican. And the lawyer says, so you've taken communion. And Hamilton admits that no, he had never taken communion. Well, this is a real oddity if he'd actually grown up Anglican. The Book of Common Prayer, which governs Anglican rites, specifies that the paired rituals of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. It would be an oddity for someone of Hamilton's age, at the age of 17, effectively the age of majority for that time period, to have never taken communion if he had actually grown up Anglican. In fact, it's such a curiosity that the judge in this trial forbids Hamilton from giving sworn testimony in court because he has insufficient bona fides as a Christian. It is yet one more piece that supports my theory that, one, Hamilton was identifying as a Christian after his mother's death, but two, he was a relative newcomer to the Christian faith. Now, Hamilton continues to work for this import-export company for another year until 1772, when a catastrophic hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. Its eye passes directly over St. Croix. Amid the twin horrors of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes are reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders are summarily extinguished. The next day, the survivors find, strewn amid the wreckage, the corpses of their neighbors. The best surviving description we have of the storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton. And according to island lore, when this description that he writes of the storm gets published later in an island paper, islanders are so taken by his precocious facility with language that they raise money to send him to America for college. And he enrolls at what was then called King's College, what we now know today as Columbia University in New York City. And when Hamilton gets to New York, he does something really interesting. He lies about his age. Piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean puts his age at, puts his year of birth at 1754. Hamilton gets to New York and he claims he's born in 1757. Why would he lie about his age? Well, the average incoming freshman at King's College skewed young, only 15 years old. It would be unsurprising if Hamilton, the outsider, Hamilton, the West Indian orphan, Hamilton, the convert, in a bid to fit in, fudged his age to seem like he was the same age as other incoming students. And the fact that he's diminutive in stature and boyish in face would have made the deception that much easier to carry out. There are two lessons we should glean from this bit of prevarication on Hamilton's part. Number one, Hamilton was perfectly willing to conceal some elemental aspect of his Caribbean origins, like his year of birth. And just as importantly, he was able to get away with it. You see, what Hamilton probably didn't think through is, he gets to New York, if he lies about his age once, for consistency's sake, he's going to have to keep doing that for the rest of his life. And he does so for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary of his ever outing his falsehood. This makes it that much more believable that he would have been perfectly willing and perfectly able to similarly conceal other aspects of his past, like a possible Jewish heritage. So take a step back and ask what all of this evidence aggregates to. There are people in corners of academia who will tell you, Porwancher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. But I take comfort in the words of one of Hamilton's rivals, John Adams, who once said famously, facts, stubborn things. So let's take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, conducted business with Jews, came from an island with a Jewish community, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. He marries Rachel, and after they get married, they have a child who is not infant baptized, who later gets an adult baptism under circumstances that only make sense if he's converting to Christianity. She has this other son out of wedlock, Alexander, for whom there's also no baptismal record, whom she enrolls in a Jewish school where he studies the Torah at a time when Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children. When Rachel tragically dies young, she's not buried in the church cemetery, and she's buried under her ex-husband's name, Levine. Then Hamilton, as a teenager, admits on the witness stand that he's never taken communion, despite the fact that that would have been an obligation for children growing up Anglican. And then he gets to New York and he proves willing and able to obscure foundational aspects of his Caribbean past. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith, all of these people, cradle to grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. As my mother likes to say when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. She's a Jew from Montreal. I don't know where she picked that up from. I don't think she's ever been south of Philadelphia, but she does say that. I realize the notion that an American founder may have had a secret Jewish identity sounds on its face a little outlandish, but my book proceeds from the fundamental premise of all research, which is that the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. I know we have a sharp crowd in Ohio. I've given talks in Ohio. I've spent a lot of time in Ohio. I know you got a very educated population up there. And so you may be a healthy sense of skepticism that you've cultivated, that you're thinking, you know what, Porwancher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about a historical figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a number of reasons. For one, Hamilton did not speak about his childhood, even with his own family. He was taciturn about his roots with others. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about any Jewish roots would have been prudent, to say the least. Hamilton biographers have largely followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his early years. Their principal interests are in the extraordinary events of his adulthood. They've only really recently started to think about his upbringing. It's not just a marginal, it's a recent endeavor. Even a basic fact about his Caribbean years, like his mother's name, remained unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise then that his religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. What's more, if you wanted to write a biography about Alexander Hamilton and just just have it be about his adult life, all of these sources from his adult life, his essays, his writings, his private letters from his American years, they've all been collected and published in a 17-volume works of Alexander Hamilton, available in most any university library. You could write an excellent biography just focusing on Hamilton's American years without ever leaving the Case Western campus. But if you want to write about his origins, you're talking about documents that are scattered across remote Caribbean islands and have often been relocated to various European capitals of the countries that colonized those islands. And these documents appear in an astounding array of languages, not just Danish, but also Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish. The painstaking task of reconstructing the obscure details of his origins is hardly worth the onerous effort for the typical Hamilton biographer whose native tongue is English and whose principal interests lie with the American Revolution or the Constitutional Convention. And so vital facts about even a renowned historical icon remain hidden for years. And I'll say, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'll just say that by way of analogy, it shouldn't strike us as terribly remote that a secret about an American founder could have endured for centuries. Consider, by way of analogy, Thomas Jefferson, For 200 years, rumors that he had fathered children with his slave, Sally Hemings, were lent little credence in academic circles. It's only really in the last generation that an enterprising scholar at Harvard, Annette Gordon Reed, has done pioneering research when combined with DNA testing has led to a new consensus that Jefferson almost certainly did father children with his slave, Sally Hemings. And yes, those children were slaves as well. So Hamilton's Jewish origins are no less real for having escaped our attention for so long. The reason that this story matters, and I'm happy to delve into this in more depth during the Q&A if people are interested, but the reason I think this story matters, the reason I think it's not just a curiosity, is because Hamilton's origins reverberate throughout his adulthood. Yes, he identifies as a Christian, but no other founder does more to make the promise of equality real for America's Jewish community in those critical formal years of the early republic. Hamilton fought for a vision of America where Jew and Gentile would stand upon an equality. And the fight that he started a quarter millennia ago continues to this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. You have numerous questions, so without fail, we're going to get right to them. The very first one, can you tell us about the schooling of Peter and the other son Rachel had in Nevis? Do they also go to Jewish schools, and are there no records of their baptisms?
Yeah, this is a very good question. There are no records of any of Rachel's sons getting baptized. So in terms of schooling, there was not a Jewish school on St. Croix where Peter grew up. So he would not have had the opportunity to attend a Jewish school. Hamilton, I had to, if you want the full story, it's all in the book. I had to boil down 7 years of research into 35 minutes. So there's a lot that I had to leave out that's in the book. But one of the things I talk about in the book is he has this other brother who's also born out of wedlock. And we don't know either way if he went to the Jewish school or not. I suspect that he did, but we just don't have any hard evidence because there are no surviving records from that school. The main reason we know about the school is because Hamilton talked about it. In fact, I mentioned Hamilton did not discuss his background even with his own family, but that's not exactly true. There's one detail that he shared with his children about his past, and it was his time at the Jewish school. And I think that it is perhaps revealing that this is the one cryptic clue about his origin story that he chose to bequeath to his children and through them to later generations.
Sam said that he's read your book and he thought it was absolutely fascinating. He has a basic question. Was Hamilton's mother actually Jewish? Are there records of her conversion to Judaism before or after her marriage to Hamilton's stepfather? He said that since Judaism is not a religion that seeks conversion, isn't it more likely that there would be some record? Levine's Judaism isn't at issue, really, but isn't hers?
Yeah, absolutely, it's at issue. And I'm really glad that you bring up this point because we don't have conversion records for her. It's not the case that there's a record with all of these Jewish conversions and she's just missing. It's that these records have been lost to history. And so the Jewish community on Nevis, which was 25% of that island's free population, no records for that Jewish community exist today. None. Everything we know about the Jewish community has come from archaeological research and documents from non-Jews discussing the Jewish community. And so this highlights a bigger issue in studying the 18th century Caribbean. Records have been lost to fire. They've been lost to hurricane. They've been destroyed. Oftentimes they've been partially eaten by bugs. One of the tragedies of the modern Caribbean is that there's a lot of money that flows through the Caribbean because of tourism, but that money gets sent to, places in other parts of the world that own the hotels and the resorts. And it's not reinvested in these local islands. And so they don't have the resources often that we have to say have the Library of Congress, which is one of the most extraordinary archives in the world. And you know, the Library of Congress, they're going to keep important documents in a temperature control setting with the perfect lighting. Unfortunately, a lot of Caribbean islands don't have the resources to do that. And so a lot of these documents have been partially eaten by termites. I use documents that look like pieces of Swiss cheese because there's certain letters that are missing because of these bugs. And so all of this is to say, you're dealing with a very fragmentary historical record. And so my claim is admittedly probabilistic. My job as a scholar of the 18th century Caribbean is to look at what scraps of evidence we do have and try to create the most plausible theory I can that accounts for the most evidence possible, while also acknowledging to my readers the limitations on my certainty. And so I take great pains in the book to acknowledge that it is a probabilistic argument. And you may have noticed that in my earliest remarks in this talk, I said tonight that the balance of evidence is suggestive of my thesis. It is a preponderance of evidence. It is not a proof beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And if, you know, as a historian, you have to get really comfortable with that kind of nuance and talking in probabilistic rather than certain terms. Because if we can't do that, there's almost nothing that we'd be able to say about the Caribbean, and that history would be entirely lost to us. So I realize my answer may be a little bit unsatisfying, that I'm, you know, don't have some big smoking gun to reveal to you, but I'm actually really glad that you asked the question, because I think it's important that people understand the importance of intellectual humility when making claims about that time and place.
Catherine wants to know a little bit about you and how you came to this investigation. She said, thank you for a very interesting thesis, and, you know, just go over your history training once more.
Sure. You know, I am trained as a historian, even though I'm actually in a constitutional studies program. And so I did my PhD in intellectual history at the University of Cambridge, and then came here to the University of Oklahoma 12 years ago now. If you can believe it, I'm dating myself, but I'm not the young man I used to be. But when I started, you know, I was brought in to teach constitutional history, and as a historian, I love to bring in biographical details of the various figures that I study. I find that if I can share something personal about a historical figure with students, that can help make something like the Federalist Papers seem less of a bloodless abstraction and more of a flesh and blood artifact of humanity. And so in reading up on Hamilton, to be able to share some details with students, I see that he's, you know, born to a mother named Rachel Levine, and she enrolled him at a Jewish school. And I thought, well, these are pretty curious facts about someone who people have always assumed was a cradle to grave Christian. And so I was very skeptical of this inherited wisdom that the son of a Rachel Levine who studied the Torah in Hebrew school was unquestionably Christian his whole life. And so I got a grant to go down to the Caribbean and do some digging in the archives. And you know, one of the things I didn't mention to my university in the grant application is that the archives are only open from 2 to 4 p.m. And so I got to spend a lot of time at the beach as well. But when I was doing archival research, it turns out that one assumption after the next that Hamilton scholars had made without actually checking the sources withered under the barest of scrutiny when you actually got into the archive and you saw what the documentary record was. And so this led me down a 7-year rabbit hole that started even before the musical came out and finally culminated in 2021 with the publication of the book. So it's been an exciting journey. And I think, you know, this is often true of a lot of professors. I think oftentimes our book ideas are born out of our classroom experiences. And so I like to have a synergy between what I'm doing on research and teaching. And I'm really indebted in a way to my students, because teaching is what ultimately pushed me to pursue this project. So thank you for that question.
Alan wants to know, and he says it's a great presentation, what alternative name could Rachel have been buried under? Did she remarry Levine or after Levine?
She did not remarry. She could have been buried under her maiden name, which was Fawcett. She descended from a French Huguenot family, the Fawcetts. And so she, and in France, perhaps, you know, Fawcett. I defer to the French speakers there. But in the British Caribbean, it was almost certainly pronounced Fawcett. So that would have been the most likely alternative. And so it is not necessarily the case that because she's buried under the name Levine, she identified as Jewish. Earlier in my remarks, the language I used was that her burial under the name Levine hints at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity, not demonstrates or proves, but hints. And so that's another example of my trying to use language that is as robust as the evidence allows, but doesn't go any further than a fragmentary record should allow me to go. So thank you for that question as well.
Tony wants to know, wouldn't Alexander have been considered a Momzar if he was born out of wedlock?
No, because his father was not Jewish.
How do you feel about the example of Hamilton and his religion being cited for the reason of his abolitionism?
And so it's a good question. I mean, Hamilton in his adulthood has a complicated relationship with slavery. And indeed, it would be difficult not to have a complicated relationship with slavery if you were a person of some means at that time. And so Hamilton is absolutely an abolitionist. He dedicates his energies to the cause of abolition. He's one of the founding members of New York's Manumission Society, one of the most important abolitionist organizations. And yet Hamilton is also implicated in the institution. He rents out slave labor. There's some debate among Hamilton scholars about whether he may have briefly even owned a slave. He certainly marries into a prosperous slave-owning family, the Schuyler family. So it's a complicated story about Hamilton and abolitionism. To the extent that it's informed by religion, it's difficult to say. Hamilton doesn't have a lot to say about religion in his adulthood. He keeps sort of a studied distance from organized Christian life. To be sure, he identifies as Christian, and he even marries a very pious woman in Elizabeth Schuyler, who is a devoted churchgoer. But Hamilton never actually joins a church in adulthood. And if you look at the communion books from Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, as I have, you see her name taking communion. You never see Alexander's. In fact, even when Alexander was laid to rest on his deathbed with Aaron Burr's bullet in his spine, he had still never taken communion. And so given this real distance from Christianity that he has, I'm hesitant to say that his Christian identity informed his views about abolitionism, whether it is a residue of a Jewish upbringing. And obviously there's a lot in Jewish heritage about Jews surviving the ordeal of slavery. Whether that informs his views is one of the mysteries of Hamilton's life. There's so much we don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if many of his views in some way are subtly but significantly informed by his origins, including that Jewish heritage. So I really appreciate that. That's an excellent question.
Unrelated to the Jewish question, what do you think that Hamilton would think today of all these newspapers folding, given that he was so involved with the New York Post?
I mean, he wouldn't be thrilled. I mean, Hamilton, I think, especially as a founder of a paper, understood the importance of freedom of the press and actually emerged as an important voice for freedom of the press. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of partisan motivation there because he was supporting the Federalist press, which was critical of his Republican adversaries. But I think Hamilton would have been really concerned. He would not have been surprised to see that the media is highly partisan. This idea of an objective, nonpartisan media is really a creature of the 20th century. Before the 20th century, it was highly polarized with, media supportive of different parties. And it seems like we're moving towards that model yet again today. And I think hundreds of years from now, historians may say the 20th century was kind of a blip. So I don't think he would have been bothered by the partisanship. but the failures of newspapers, I think, would have deeply alarmed him, and it concerns me, and I'm guessing the person who asked that question, it concerns them as well. So, you know, I'm sure a lot of people read the Journal or the Post or the Times, and these are great papers, but I'm sure we could all agree it's important to support our local papers, because I'm fearful of the corruption that might run rampant in city governments, where sometimes the only major paper has been shut down. So these are all good things to reflect on.
Well, we can't very well mention Hamilton without mentioning that other name and his wonderful duel with Mr. Burr. And maybe not wonderful, but the duel. One walks into a duel with an open mind that one may die. Do you think that his lack of a religion influenced his behavior in the duel?
I think that Hamilton,
Lack of a declared religion.
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of religious people, especially ministers from the pulpit at that time, preached against dueling. And so I think Hamilton had he been more tethered to the church, it's possible that he may well have been more reluctant to duel. Ultimately, and this is just my own sort of psychological read on Hamilton, and people can, you know, they can read the book if they want and come to their own conclusions. I do write about the duel as well. I think that he's so scarred by his upbringing. Here's someone whose father abandons him, whose mother dies young, who, you know, the Danish courts rob him of his inheritance. He's left a destitute orphan. A hurricane destroys his island. And here is someone who is an outsider, who's got nothing. And he has a huge chip on his shoulder. He is incredibly sensitive to slights, real or perceived, on his honor. And while we often lament the tragedy of losing Hamilton so young, when all the other founders got to live into their golden years, the truth is it's kind of a miracle Hamilton lived as long as he did. He was like the first over the barricades in the Battle of Yorktown. He nearly got in a number of other duels that were narrowly evaded before his duel with Burr. It's like Hamilton had a death wish. And the real tragedy of Hamilton, in a way, isn't just his childhood. It's the fact that at the end of his life, he had a loving wife. He had a large family. He was one of the most important political figures of his day. He had, you know, after he retires as Treasury Secretary, a very successful legal practice. He had a country home. He had the pleasures and comforts he had never known as a scrappy orphan in the Caribbean. And yet, for all that he had achieved, it seems to me that he could never overcome the psychological trauma of his childhood, and that there was some piece of him that, for all the achievements of his life, he felt that only glory in death could ultimately fill that hole.
That's interesting to say, because aren't there people that say the only reason Hamilton wasn't a president was a lady named Maria Reynolds?
As opposed to what?
That he had all of the conditions, all of the qualities, all of the opportunities to be a president, and this one incident with this one woman shot down his ability to become president.
Yeah.
They put it down to that as opposed to anything else. I mean, had he been outwardly declared Jewish, certainly he wouldn't have been elected president at that time.
Yeah, that's right. Here's what I would say. I think I absolutely buy the idea that the Maria Reynolds scandal was devastating to his career. But I would argue that it was symptomatic of a broader psychology that Hamilton had that was ultimately self-destructive. When Hamilton was second banana to George Washington, who was a person of, you know, in his political life, of moderation and of being circumspect, of holding his tongue and studiously observing the scene, very different than Hamilton, who's bombastic and histrionic and liked to pick fights. When Hamilton was playing second fiddle to Washington under Washington's moderating influence, I think Hamilton had a lot to contribute. You know, when you look at what he accomplished as Treasury Secretary, creating the economic foundations of which our political experiment in self-government might well endure, it's extraordinary. But after Washington's death, Hamilton, left to his own devices, is given way to some of his worst instincts, like publishing a pamphlet outing himself as a philanderer. And so the Maria Reynolds story, yes, it absolutely, I think, was a major factor in precluding him from the presidency. But I suspect that if it wasn't that, he would have done something else that precluded him from becoming president, like dying too young in a duel to then run for office in 1808. And so Hamilton, he was a risk taker. And when you're a scrappy Caribbean orphan and you live life like you've got nothing to lose, there are huge potential upsides, but that's also a kind of decision-making psychology that can be incredibly risky. And, you know, as a professor who holds his tenure dear, I don't quite have that same appetite for risk-taking.
Andrew, this leaves us with a great place to sort of wrap this up. And Catherine has the best question of all. With regard to the musical, how accurate do you think it is?
This is a terrific question. I think that the musical, which I've had the pleasure of seeing a couple of times, is in important respects not accurate. And I don't say that as a criticism. I think playwrights should have artistic license to reimagine the past in their own ways. A play or a musical is not, you know, a book of scholarship that's, you know, densely footnoted with all the sources. I think someone like Lin-Manuel Miranda rightly has a lot more license than I do. And so it is not accurate in so many respects. And yet, in a way, Hamilton's story as rendered by Lin-Manuel Miranda, I think, is actually closer to the truth than many Hamilton biographies. Because as mentioned, a lot of Hamilton biographers gloss over his childhood and really focus on his adult years. And what I have found is that actually his childhood is critically important to explaining his later adulthood. And indeed, talk to any child psychologist in the country and they'll tell you, you know, what happens in the first 5 or 10 years of life is absolutely essential for making sense of the later decades. And what Miranda does is he starts the musical with a discussion, a song about Hamilton's origins. And then if you look closely at the lyrics in other songs, he repeatedly refers back to Hamilton's childhood. Miranda is keenly sensitive to the import of one's upbringing on their later years in a way that I think a lot of biographers, not just of Hamilton, but of all kinds of figures, could learn something from. So I'm really grateful to him, not only for helping make a figure like Hamilton a household name again, and making him the kind of figure that's like cool with teenagers, and creating all this public demand for talks like this. But I'm also grateful because I think in his own subtle way, Miranda is telling us something important about the place of one's youth and understanding their maturity. So thank you for that. Is a really good question to close on. So I'm grateful for it.
Thank you, Andrew, for speaking with us tonight. Thank you for writing this phenomenal book. Everybody, I'm telling you, you got to go read this book. It really was very eye-opening and interesting, and it's a very thoughtful thesis put together that we should examine. And remember to join us next time for our future program. I believe it is Mr. Munson from Tech to Table, all about technology and food. Thank you again, Andrew. Make sure you go to the Learned Owl or come to the library and check out the book and read it. And I wish you all a wonderful Northeast Ohio evening. Good night. Thank you. Goodbye.